what some of us are fighting for is to see that this oppressive system is crushed. We don't care whether, I don't even care whether I would be part of the top echelon in the room. I'm not worried, but I'm dying to see a change that, in the system. That's all. That's all.
Taigara mumako Zimbabwe Zimbabwe manya dakabatesa Zimbabwe Taigara mumako Zimbabwe manya dakabatesa Zimbabwe vakomana vasikana Zimbabwe magorira makomo
Thank you for tuning in to Zim News Beat TV with Robert Pfukwa.
So where are we today? Today we are in Bindura. We have followed a man, but probably I would say an old man. But during that time he was a man. Turakuziva kuti murume uyu kana kuti mukomana watakagara naye pazuva ranhasi hongu pazuva angave sekuru angave ani asi panguva iyoyo akanga ari ani ari mwana wekwapfukwa. Regai tigare pasi navo tiite hurukuro tinzwe kuti zvakamira sei. Prof Pfukwa. Handifani kutanga nekuti Prof. Makadizve.
Tiripo makadini.
Finally we have met. Prof, turakutanga nechimukomana chidiki chiri kwapfukwa chichikura chichitamba kuti chakazvarirwa kupi chikakurira kupi kumhuri yekwapfukwa.
Ndinotenda Robert.
Yes, yeah. Ukona kuti pane mibvunzo yamunobvunza ma-students achitadza kupindura asi muri professor ndi asi muri kuona mubvunzo wamuri kubvunzwa ne-student ichibvunza professor vari kutadza kupindura. Andiriya.
Yeah. Ndakazvarwa kuChipinge.
Okay.
It is a small mission called Chikore Mission. But the Eastern Highlands, past Mutare, past Vumba, past Chimanimani, go along Mount Slinda, it's to the west of Mount Slinda. Uninga wakutunange Musabi Valley.
Okay.
It's a semi-dry, semi-whatever. 1958, new environment yandiri iyo. It's a Ndau speaking community.
Okay.
Inima links nevanguni, so yo Soshangana, yo Mzila, yo Ngungunyana, But by the time Ngungunyana is in his middle years of power, he left the area.
Okay.
Udzokere ku Bien, that's in Maputo. So there's a lot of crisscrossing between Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and that's part of the explanation. So that's part of the space and history area. I grew up in a mission, went to a mission school, which by default, yanga ine vana missionary. And in Rhodesia, Varungu didn't allow Vanawe Varungu kudzidzana ma blacks.
Okay.
Yeah. But because my parents and my missionaries didn't want Vanawa to end up kudzidza muzvikoro zvavarungu, fair, mama, the European schools, your A schools. They turned this into a semi-A school. So my childhood friend, Murunga, still have a picture. And I think he's retired. Daru Cape Town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my sister anga in age mate yake. My younger sister, they're deceased. My sisters are going. Wanga va in my age mates are tamba now in that minute. So that's the school I go to. We had about 4 hours of power every evening, generator.
What?
So I could read.
Okay.
So reading is not a mystery, was not a mystery when I went into grade 1 or into secondary school and all that kind of thing, you know. I would read, and much of it was American literature, you know, so that's where I read your cowboys, your Davy Crockett's, your Bill Hickok, your George Washington's, etc., etc. So I was immersed in European history, I was immersed in American history at that early age because these were American missionaries and obviously the British coming in as well. So that's the background I come into. But by the time I get into grade 7 and all that kind of thing, you know, you begin to pick up vibrations, echoes of struggle, 67, 68, you know. African Times talks about terrorists. There was this Minister of Information, Immigration and Tourism, which circulated freely. So they talk about these terrorists. But then in whispers you would hear about Zambia, and then my father also collected my books. For his standard 6, I think he was a good reader. Because I remember even after the war, he would throw in a word. And I would look at him and say, no, I have to find the dictionary to get hold, to understand this word. So he would tell you when you're sitting in a chair, rescind from there. Rescind. You rescind, what does it mean? You know? So that's, and I could understand it. He had the collection of African nationalist books facing Mount Kenya. Zambia shall be free. African nationalism, as told, and for obvious citizens, proximity, Yeduna Stole in that manner. He was born in that, he was brought up in that area, you know, and he had spaces. So my old man was very friendly. So this is the kind of literature I was also exposed to. It didn't mean much, but seeing the picture of Kaunda with his long bibo, you know, his long hair, and he said, Zambia shall be free, wearing his kente cloth around him, or Kwame Nkrumah, you know, so I would see the pictures and all that kind of thing. So I think those are the first signs of national consciousness coming in. By 1971,
but before we go there, how was it to sit in a classroom next to a white young man, in terms of racial discrimination then?
Didn't mean anything to me. Didn't mean anything to us.
What about,
For him as well.
Okay.
For the color didn't mean much.
Right.
The color didn't mean much. It was the ideal racial integration that you talk about.
Okay.
We only sensed it, we only picked it up when we traveled to Harare. My first journey to Harare was 1969. I'm coming into a science exhibition. Very close to your STEM-driven kind of thing that is being done in education right now. So they promoted science then. There was this European called Mike Robson. He was in science education and he was crazy about it. So he would go into those spaces, look for young people, and he was part of the organizations of science exhibitions. So that's how we came into Harare. That's when I discovered that, I belong to a different color altogether.
Okay.
And these people are not the same as my friend here. So that's when I picked up a sense of racial discrimination. Bulawayo, 1971, another science exhibition again. But ironically, our school would scoop prizes. And I was one of those who scooped the prize there. Just mixing ash and lemon juice. And it goes pop, how it fizzles and all that kind of thing. Just that, So it was the innovativeness. Unfortunately, it didn't go into science because at some point, I think I went wayward in terms of mathematics and I didn't know. But, there were big things for us, going to Harare and to Bulawayo. But then that's where we began to see racial discrimination is discrimination. It didn't bite much into us as young people then or as children then. But by 1971, 72, I moved to St. Augustine's for secondary school education. That travel in that space, getting into Mtari, again, it's a different space now. and you see how the experience of people is different, and you link it with the politics of it all. You go through white farms, you see white men doing this and that. You see, we are different, and these are more privileged.
Yeah.
You know. So with the literature and the knowledge and all the experiences that we are reading and picking up in all those, and I was also exposed to media, electronic media. There was Radio Moscow.
Okay.
There was already a Radio Lusaka somewhere in those years. Yeah. So the sum total of all these experiences of the electronic media, the radio, and the newspapers, and we were reading quite a lot. December 71, war clouds gather. And we also had access to the Herald.
Okay.
So there were quite a few reports that there are movements in the northeastern area of Zimbabwe. There are movements. Nobody could pinpoint them. And on one occasion, Ian Smith addresses the nation. And he talks about, you know, war is coming. And these guys, these terrorists, the code named Chimurenga.
Yes.
That's how we put it. So the word Chimurenga, it was already familiar.
Okay.
Yeah, not in its depth, but that Chimurenga will mean liberation struggle. So then 72, the guns really explode then.
In the Eastern Islands.
In the Altena farm.
Okay.
That's your Altena. Altena struck us very deep. And we didn't get it second hand. We read it in the press because we could access the newspaper. We could access the Herald. So there you hear of the Whistlefield farm, you know, the debauched graves and all that, you know. By the time I go to school, there are 1 or 2 people who are coming in from the northeast who give more details. The capture of Gerald Hawksworth, you know. So a lot of things are happening, and I'm only 13 years of age now. So that's about it. 73, 74, a lot of things happen, and it's reported. And the Magandanga 15, and all that funny discourse that you would pick in the Rhodesian, and you would hear, you know, a lot of it from the radio, from the newspapers, from the media. Then they were also in the libraries at St. Augustine's. There was literature which was independent of government media. So it will describe what's Zanla, what's by the time you get to 74, 75, what's happening in Zambia, what's happening to Zipra, Algerians, Tanzania, and all that kind of thing, your detente period, etc., etc. You know, I'm saying at St. Augustine's, you know, Form 4, 75, Chitepo dies. And about the same time, there was a coup in Portugal, 1974, and obviously that our neighbors are getting independent, you know. It's now in the fingers, it's now in the daily discourse of everybody in our eastern border schools, eastern border communities. And there I was waiting for all-level results. Rhodesian forces are in the mission, they are patrolling, gunfire somewhere, somehow I saw a bit of it, I saw a bit of them, they harassed me a bit, and I realized if I hang around with these guys, either I'll be beaten up or he'll be drafted. As soon as all-level results were through, I went again back for A-level, St. Augustine's. But by then I think things were untenable. Things were untenable. The bill for call-up was introduced that all able-bodied young men, regardless of color, go for call-up.
By Smith?
Yes. I think that was the last straw. I think that was the last straw for that generation of young people.
All right.
And I belong to that generation.
So, before the collapse, I want to take you back to the mission in Chipinge. The missionaries were white.
Yeah.
You know, your friend is also white.
Yeah.
You are reading this from the Herald. You know, the terrorists are being killed. And the terrorists are also killing the white people.
Yes.
But there is do the missionaries ever had a conversation with you guys as, you know, what is happening here is...
I can put them in two categories.
Okay.
They were pro-Rhodesian players.
Okay.
But most of the missionaries, given their own training and their religious convictions, they worked among the blacks.
Okay.
So their sympathies lay with the black people.
Okay.
You know.
Okay.
If they had any other orientation, I think it was never pronounced. But generally, the communities that they worked with. And they were often deported after some time.
Yeah.
You know, there's a history of missionaries being deported in our specific community. And right across the nation, I think missionaries would come in, work for 2-3 years, deported. You know, the doctors, obviously. You know, the Hippocratic Oath, I think it tells you to heal everybody. So they were familiar with some of these activities.
Yeah.
So they were always in conflict with the farmers.
Why?
The farmers would say, these missionaries are aiding and abetting the terrorists.
Okay.
And those who support them, the community, obviously. You know. So you must deport them. You must send them away. You must, you know, arrest them. So they were always at loggerheads with the farmers.
Yes, I understand.
And those farmers had good reasons. One of our neighbors, you know, at a place called Craigmore Farm, you know, I think I was at school on one of those occasions. That farmer was attacked, you know. And the farmer never came back. He had to go into safer places. Imagine you are farming in Matepatepa and then gunfire all over.
Yeah.
So you move and live in Bindura and then operate back into that. And I'll come back to that kind of story where farmers had to move into town and then go to their farms during the day. This is where I'll come to the story of Johannes Martin, some Whipper headlands up. We'll come to that at the right moment.
Okay.
Right.
Now back to the collapse. Smith.
So, the bill has been drafted, and I think it's in Parliament or it's being drafted and all that kind of thing. We had demonstrations, you know, and our headmaster, Kibble Prosa, sympathized with us. We went into town, Mutari, you know, quite a few names which I would recall. But anyway, we went to town, and we were arrested, sent back to school. 1 or 2 were detained. But the headmaster, the same Kibble Prosa, may his soul rest in peace. His ashes are actually at St. Augustine's as well. Okay. He stood for his students. And by that time, we went into lower sixth. I remember when we were doing our Form 4, a class of 30, we ended up writing exams, half the class. You would wake up one morning, 3 beds, have no people. You wake up one day, you go into a class, 7 people are missing. You know, it was a massive wave, and it was a spontaneous experience. Nobody sat with those young people and said, young people, let's go to war. You know, the kind of Lord Kitchener thing where your country needs you. There was nothing like that. It was as if some spiritual wave, you know, breathed into schools and every young person. My only strength was we managed to sit it out and write our O-level exams.
Okay.
In other words, I went out into the struggle after, in lower sixth, you know. But many of my friends had already gone.
So,
I can't.
You woke up in the morning, you see 2-3 beds are empty. What was the discussion then among those that were, you know, when you're walking to the dining, when you're walking to the classroom, you know, Robert, Frank, they've gone into, it was obviously they've gone into the struggle. What was the discussion for you guys that were, you know?
Generally, it's a question of time. It was a question of time. Maybe you are still, you are not yet in terms of age.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, 17, 18, 19. Mostly it was the O-levels, A-levels, and that kind of thing. You can imagine, I can sing a string of names, you know, of people who went, some who, even after A-level, or at university. You know, the late Vuma, he's an alumnus.
Okay.
I remember at St. Augustine's, he was Form 4, I was in Form 1. Comrade Mshangwa, sometime he was at St. Augustine's. And the late Duri, he was at St. Augustine's. I think somebody called Sobuza, I think. But they're coming in from university.
Yeah.
So when you hear of university people going, who are you at secondary school not to? You know? So that's the kind of idea.
Yeah.
So we're going to our A-levels there. The late Chigwedere, Dr. Thompson Sozo. They were recruiters par excellence. They were conduits at St. Augustine's. So people coming in from all over the country, they would pass through St. Augustine's. That's where the last point of getting directions, because it was just maybe from 5 kilometers beyond the border. So, you know, it was a stone's throw for us, for all of us, for most of us. In April, I had a sister who was in Sanyati. She was married and lived in Sanyati. My parents advised her, take this young man. If he stays with us, Pingu, the next thing is we will hear, given his frame of mind, I suppose I was showing it one or another, that I was getting, they could see the restiveness. I was getting ill at ease in many, many ways. So Sanyati, you know, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of the country. You wouldn't think. So I spent that holiday there, you know, and I couldn't contact anybody. When I came back to school, I meet a friend. He's talking about people and the comrades that he met in Onde Valley, you know, the activity that they were doing and all the action and all that kind of thing. And for some reason, he was beaten up actually with his parents and all that kind of thing. And that entrenched the bitterness in him. Okay. For me, it was purely out of, you know, the spirit of the day. And imagine, we are peers here. We are young people, late teens, full of energy, you know. And I'm saying, shall I expend my energy fighting against my own friends if I were to wear that sickly green camouflage? Against my own friends who have crossed the border, might as well go and join them. You know, so that's how it grew. August 76, Nyadzonya. It was a big tragedy. All over the radio, all over. It was a trial for the Rhodesian and that kind of thing. And up to this day, it was the greatest cowardly act. If ever anything fired up the young people of that time, it was Nyadzonya. With all its sadness and all the bloodshed and all that. After that, you'd actually declare, I will go and die with those guys. That's how it became. It emboldened the spirit of many and that spirit. So the waves continue. The waves continue. So our delegation, I meet, the name Augustine Tungwarara is familiar to you? Yes. So there he was in the library, he's reading a map. And the map is eastern border. I'm just passing through, I look at the map and I look at the man, I look at the map and I look at the man. I took my seat. But by then I think we are all fired up. So that evening after discussion, you were reading a map, what were you looking at? He says, no, I was looking at that map and seeing the boardhead. You know, he was one of those brilliant guys, you know, and if you remember Shingitu Ngwarara. We coalesced into a group of about 5. Okay. So there is me, there is Augustine Tungwarara, there is William Tanaurwa, there is Patrick Mshowe, may his soul rest in peace as well. Augustine is also deceased, may his soul rest in peace. There is Mark Manyuma. So quietly we planted this. There was a sixth person, I think. But it was safer to keep the numbers low.
It's small, yeah.
So I don't know what happened to the sixth. He never went and he never joined us
Okay.
that morning. And how do we put this plan into operation? So Patrick engaged Mr. Chigodere, ambassador. And he advised us to do this and that and that. And Dr. Sozo was also part of it.
Okay.
These are our teachers who teach us Hamlet and so kind of thing. And your Sozo teaches your Shona and all that. So they're sending young men to war, you know. You see, it explains why soon after the war you see them getting their spaces and that recognition nationally. Yeah. Madara yakarwa hondo yao. Yeah. A big role that they played anyway. Going back to my story. So you'd have all sorts of codes. So we advised. Endai pamshapa ningimoti tatuma murio. Then you get those, oh, matuma murio. All right, shenda ipamhiri hapo. Mono waudza kuti something, some kind of password for the day. You know. We left the comfort of our beds at St. Augustine's in sometime early September. About 3 weeks after Nyazonya. 3 weeks after Nyazonya, I think. It's about 6 a.m. Just walked out and that's it. Beds are empty as you're describing. 1, 2, 3 beds are no longer. By 10 a.m., we were received by the community Kuseru. They saw us descending the hill. And then we were given a space. Okay. Then the committee, councillors, etc., they took us, and then there we are. This is just east of Penalonga. You know, and there's Enyaronga on the other side of the, near Mashpanda. Then we went into Villa Manica for 2-3 days. Then life changed drastically. You know, then you realize things are no longer the same. No breakfast here. You know, a crowd of 30 suddenly swells into a crowd of 60. You know, and you're using one bathroom. Okay, there's food. There's still enough food, but it's no longer normal. By day 4, the crowd has swelled to about 200. So, okay, let's move now. So we're taken to Chimoyo, a place called Daf. And people will talk about Badaf, you know, another transit camp, Badaf. So we get to Daf already, there are another maybe 400 waiting for us there. You know, and every day you are seeing influx of 100 people, you know, the swelling crowds, you know. And you know, these young people, they're not coerced. And most of them are in school uniform. You could see that this is Moleli, this is St. Mary's, this is Hartzell, you know, whatever. You could see But what was striking was the energy in these young people. You know, it's a whole generation. It's a story which, when I look at young men today, and I feel very sorry for them. You know, the times when they waste away in their
the drugs,
that kind of thing. So there is Duff. You can see the crowds that we are in for something. So we wait for our transport, 3-4 days there, then we move to Doroi. Doroi is a story that can fill volumes. Unfortunately, nobody has really focused on Doroi. So we move into Doroi. Security processes are done. By that time now, I think for every 100, you have a spy, an intelligence person. It's no surprise. It's no surprise. With a good reason, obviously. You know, you want to go and see who's doing what, where, and ways of relaying the information. Well, for our age, we were not aware of it. But by then, security was aware, especially after the Nyati experience at Nyadzonya. You know, so Doroi was the new camp that emerged from the ashes of Nyadzonya. You know, So it was still in its nascent stages. It's only about 4 weeks old. There is still some grass around, you know. But already I'm seeing numbers of about 6,000-7,000.
Yes.
When you see the companies, when you saw the companies on march, on the march, they would raise dust into the air. This is the hot September sun of 1976. And you will see these teams, you know, marching in different directions, and here I am bewildered as it is. Wow, you know, are they going for training, whatever it is, and all that? I'll come back to that later. But you could sense again the sense of determination, the force, the spirit of sacrifice in these young players, you know, all ready to go for training, as it is. So we were in a company, in a battalion E, or I think it was battalion E.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bakunzi komrendana.
It was Chimurenga, Nhamo Chimurenga or something, Shepherd Chimurenga, Nhamo Chimurenga. I think it was Nhamo Chimurenga. I have not yet picked up Shepherd.
Okay.
Because by the time I get to the front, I think Shepherd had the swag. You know, so that's what I ended up with. And by the end of the war, it's dynamics. It's a good reason. But anyway, let's go back to Doroi. Doroi is a narrative. I have to tell this narrative because many never lived to tell the tale. Neither would many have the courage to retell the nightmare of Doroi. As numbers swelled, the space didn't grow. That's important. The space didn't grow. So, the congestion, sanitation declines, logistically food supplies, etc., etc. The logistics of feeding 5,000 people today and then feeding 7,000 people next week. You know, how do you plan? How do you schedule that?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a place called the Gozinya.
Yes.
The Gozinya, you've heard of that?
Yes.
You know? It's a polite way of describing a shabby cooking place, which is far from being that befits that description.
Yeah.
Very unhealthy. Food was prepared mzvikanga, you know, half drums, you know, in an enclosure. And security-wise, there was a lot of danger and poisoning and all that kind of thing. But you could spend a day without eating if you're not careful and all that kind of thing. So those were the nightmares. I will not get into further details. I think it's a bit difficult.
But we want to hear them. Because who then is going to tell us about the experiences at Doroi?
You have been to a rural deep tank. That's the best image I can give you of the Gozinya at Doroi. So it was built with stockades, you know, vast space, you know, maybe about as big as a football ground. So people would sit in companies. Then the feeding point, very similar to a deep tank, you know, and everybody was headed into that.
Yeah.
And if it is not your turn, if you are found anywhere near the feeding point, Nanasi, I have a phrase that I use. If you hear me use that phrase, that's Zamiro.
Okay.
You will not find me in a queue, queuing for food in the humiliating manner that we went through at Doroi.
Okay.
So, we endured that, or I endured it for 2 months. That's October, November. Yes, October, November. And amidst that, I saw we became emaciated. I saw Shingi Tungwarara. He had a bout of malaria. He had to use words, to tie his glasses so that they won't fall off.
Yes.
That's how big. And he was somebody who was, I think it was, he needed glasses anyway.
Yeah.
But, when you get to a point where you can no longer
They cannot hold
them and had to use, that improvisation on its own was a big statement. And malaria in Mozambique is not just any malaria that we experience here. Unaenda kumakuwa. Unaenda kumakuwa ni malaria in Mozambique. For some reason, I was lucky I didn't. The other thing about Doroi was, if you had elected to go into the war by some kind of persuasion or forced into it, you would condemn whoever persuaded you. So here I am now. I'm looking at this and saying, this was my decision. This is my music. I have to face this music. I am responsible. That on its own, I think, gave people guts, energy to go on.
Yeah.
It was only the spirit and the soul that drove those people. Little food, insalubrious conditions, disease. My friend Patrick Mshove, he was drafted into the medical corps.
Okay.
For some reason, I don't know how he managed it, and he went into that. So I would visit him at the clinic. The wounds that I saw, I elected never to visit that place again, even if I was ill. But for some, because they'd never seen a clinic, for some, because they'd never seen any medical treatment, for them it was the place of treatment. Yeah. But because I had seen a proper dispensary, because I had seen proper spaces that deliver health, I declared I would not go into that. My solution, for an example, on imagine you have a wound on the legs, maybe a scratch somewhere, that kind of thing, and you bleed. There was always the danger, given those conditions, that it would turn septic, And how do you manage a septic condition like that? For some reason, and this is your comrade yakavana kupiko. And this is forgery. Kwanguchekwa so. It's a forgery.
Which forgery? Yebute or the massacres?
But normally yebute anga isinganya buteranga singanya kuonika. But the green tobacco, swarimba. So mature in the communities, because that's the tobacco that we smoke.
Yes.
Yeah. So you just rub it a bit and put the juice onto the wound. Okay. No fly would go there. And in a day it would cover up, and you know how it heals itself. In other words, you built your own immune systems and managed it. Yeah. And then the other thing was, well, at least we kept ourselves active. That was very, very important. You get this with the story of Matekenya. I think you've heard 1,000 stories about that one. It was nasty. It always, the Matekenyas fed on people who kept their feet in the dust, who were not active, who didn't shake Matekenya off. So if you were laid back and did not want to actively involve yourself in camp activities like, toi, you want to go for collecting firewood, collecting grass to build a barrack and all those activities. If you did not participate, that's the right place for Matekenya to crawl in. So it was important. Then when you went for a bath, on that rare occasion when you had a bath, in the evening, afternoons or evenings, you would make sure you go and you inspect your toes with your hands, Interestingly, there was no soap to talk about as well. There was no soap to talk about, but it was important. So if Matekenya rikapinda so, it would grow, isn't it? Normally in the fingers and in the toes. It was just under the nail. That's where they thrived. When you removed it, you would put tobacco juice. That was the best treatment. That was the best remedy. Not to go to that clinic, that God-forsaken clinic that I'm talking about. So that was a way of survival. So I see Doroi for 2 months. Fortunately, the deaths were not yet in their large numbers.
Okay.
But come 78, I think 70, where are we?
76.
76, right?
Into
76.
78.
Yeah,
Into
mid 77,
Yeah.
before they were broken up into smaller camps. I'm told there were quite a few deaths now. When I met Shingirai after the war, and we were discussing, his own experience at Doroi before he went to Maputo, they would dig graves every morning. Not because somebody was dead, in anticipation of 3, 4, 5 deaths. I remember somebody else I met elsewhere, they ended up digging trenches and then just laying one and head and foot. That's Doroi for you. And if ever you were to ask me, I don't know how we can go back to those spaces, because those graves are now unmarked.
Okay.
But there might be more people who died at Doroi than at Chimoyo, in the Nyadzonya, for all we know. But then the late Brigadier Mchemwa and other medics, they found that the only solution to resolve the problems at Doroi was to break it up into smaller camps, sub-camps. And that was the ultimate, to decongest the camp. So in 1970, end of 77, I think it was 78, they decongested the camp. That's what resolved it. Anyway, Tosia Doroi. December 1, 2, about that time, some people appeared per camp, Doroi. And there were 2 types of whistles, one an emergency whistle and then the normal one for parade and all that. So it was the emergency whistle which was blown, and then people come running, this or that, what's happening here? So imagine a whole camp. And only 3 names were called out. I was one of them. The other one is Isa Ushitauro. I'm not quite sure where he is right now, but we were taken up. They were setting up a media and publicity. You see, this is why at times I will always say media is not new to me. Media is not new. And what were we taken up to do?
So it was you, Stauro, and
Tauro, yes, and another one is Otto. I remember the Chimurenga name.
Oh, okay.
Otto
All right,
Chimurenga,
okay.
yes. We were taken in as artists to develop illustrations and cartoons for a forthcoming journal.
Okay.
Yeah, and even today I can still show you my skills in art, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And for your own information, a few of my pieces were displayed in the National Gallery when I was in primary school and secondary school.
Okay.
It's only that in Rhodesia we were never given the opportunity to pursue that space.
Yeah.
But I think I could have done well.
Okay.
As well. But anyway, it was. I give credit to this skill in art that plucked me out of the jaws of Doroi. I always remember that. So only 3 of us were bundled into that Land Rover. I'm not sure
Who was the commander then? Who gave the order?
He was a guy who was coming in from Chimoyo.
Okay.
He was coming in from Chimoyo. I think it's Geza. Chimurenga name, not the late.
Okay.
So we were taking a Land Rover to Chimoyo. After that, life became different. Life became easy.
Okay. Life
became a holiday, relatively speaking. Yeah. For me, that was the end of my trials and tribulations.
At Doroi.
If you were to ask me, there is never a day I went to sleep to bed hungry. I never missed a meal in the liberation struggle,
At Doroi.
even at Doroi.
Okay, why?
Well-
How did you maneuver? You know?
No, well, I mean, one meal was normal. One meal was normal.
Yes.
Yeah. So that
So
I
you
would-
never missed that one meal.
I never missed that one meal.
What was the skill?
No, it was no. That period there was enough food
Oh,
to go
okay, all
around.
right, okay.
Because people will talk of days of hunger at Doroi. People will talk of days at hunger at Nyazonya. You know, people will talk of hunger during detente. You know, half the players that you talk about in the liberation struggle define detente. They will tell you detente is a period of suffering,
Yes.
of hunger, and all that kind of thing. So for me, I never went through this. So we go to Chimoyo. I landed at Chitepo College,
Wambo.
you know, Kuma PC. Kuma PC. Chimoyo camp, before it was attacked in November 2023, so 1978. Yeah, Chimoyo camp. Sorry. Chimoyo camp was composed of about nine camps. So, Chitepo College was one of them, where they were training the PCs for the liberation struggle. So, I didn't go there as a student. It was just a stopover.
Okay.
Yes, as we were preparing to work in the Department of Publicity and Information. You know. And this is for the Zipper team. Washandi. Those are the guys who were designing the course. Those are the guys who were designing the information and publicity and that kind of thing. So, I think what delayed the processes was Geneva.
Okay.
It was during Geneva period that we moved into Chimoyo. You know. Meanwhile, some of us enjoyed our stay there. I was working with trained people. And once you were trained, life became different. A trained person was very different from an untrained person.
Okay.
Privileges, opportunities, for obvious reasons, because you are trained. You can be given a gun any time to go to
the front.
or given certain duties because you are now trained. You know, that was it. So they were always saying, "I know these guys are not trained, so we will not bother them." But then there was something about Wampoa College then. You know, like any other institution, people will have discussions after lectures and they come back and talk. So you're hearing people talking about Numen Bodbethun. You're hearing people talking about paper tigers, talking about mistaken ideas. The whole thing about, you know, the Mao Zedong perspectives. And that's where I would pick up. And education, real education, is not necessarily in the classroom.
Yes.
Education occurs at any point, anywhere in human experience. And real education is a continuous experience throughout life. So, I learned a lot in the barracks, as they would discuss. So there were people like your young Mchatiroto. There was a senior Mchatiroto. There was Sunungurai. There was Shatagotsi. There was Webb. There was Chitio. There was Deluxe, Dingwani, and a few other players. There were quite a few. They would engage in these discussions. And as I was saying, it was Taiteji, Kenneth Taiteji, who was designer. The lecturer, one of the lecturers was Gamanya. I think Sunungurai was also there at some point. I didn't have the privilege to attend these lectures, But I recall the energy with which these guys would engage in Marxist-Leninist thoughts. But I had one privilege. In the evenings, I could wander into the library. There was a generator, and you could, after the evening, after supper, you could go into the library and read. But then, how many of us are readers? For some of us, there was the opportunity to revisit the word, you know. So I went into selected works of Mao Zedong. I read quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, from volume 1 to volume 4. And I would pick up what we had done in orientation, during orientation and in the discussions that we were given. So this is why I recall all of this. And for example, the 8 points of attention. Kunenzira dzemasoja dzokudzibatana nadzo and all that kind of thing. That thing is drawn from Mao's selected works.
Yes.
It was then translated into Shona, and then that's how it was turned into a song. So you would pick it up and how it was built there. There were so many other texts. I tried reading Marx per se, but then German discourse is dense. You know, you can't read half a page and say you've picked up anything.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if you compare it with the writings, selected works of Mao, it's different. I tried reading Kim Il-sung equally. I suppose also the problem of translation and all that kind of thing.
Right.
So I didn't bother about most of these. My center generally was on the selected works, which I enjoyed. February, March, I was hit by malaria. And it really hit me hard. Day 1, we were having breakfast called sadza and beans. Tinned beans, not just any beans. So I think it was a few muscles, and then suddenly my knees are weak, and I want to lay down. And that was it. That was malaria. By lunchtime, it's really in. So the medics come in, and there was this medic, he was called Michael. Says, no, Shamarune malaria. So I knew the implications of malaria, that if you don't take medication and you don't take food, you are gone. Not from any experience in Mozambique, but way back home. I remember nursing my kid sister, who was down on malaria. And after that, we were always given half a tablet or a quarter of a tablet for quite some time, you know, after that. So I knew very well that I must stick to the medication. Parirenyatwa clinic was about 100 meters away, just across a little valley. So I went there, I was given a card for recording purposes. Then I had to keep it. So in the morning I would wake up, go to the clinic, get my medication, come back, sleep. Lunchtime, I would wake up. Religiously, I took my medication. I would wake up. That's the only thing I could do, but I didn't eat for 3 days. But I knew very well that I have to take this medication. And this guy, he was called Michael, I think he died in Chimurenga. I owe him. He would check every evening. What's going to say? You know, they would just look at him. I ended up seeing people, the delirium is terrible. You know, you see yourself fading, really moving spiritually away from, you know. So I would hear Webb singing, I would hear Webb talking, I would hear. So on day 3, Michael comes with an orange drink and biscuits in the bush. In the bush. That was my first meal, proper meal for after 3 days, I think. You know. And I remember taking down the mazoe that he gave me and the biscuits. You know. Well, it didn't make much difference. But I suppose the idea of having something in your stomach, that's what was important. By day 4, I could see myself coming back again now. But it really hit me hard. But you wouldn't believe it. I never suffered from malaria again. Nanas.
All right.
Ndinorumwa mosquito kuti Anopheles mosquito. With this black and white and all those legs were up like that. I've never suffered from malaria again. And we are talking of 1977. How many years ago, ma'am? Anyway, so I'm much better. But emaciated, I lost weight. Never to recover that weight until some 20 years ago, I think. I never recovered that weight again. I hovered around 53, 54 kg. I went into training at about 52 kg. Emaciated. I was mtoto. Imagine an 18-year-old boy achieving training. So soon after the malaria, I go into training. Mapinduzi. Mapinduzi was later renamed Takawira 1. Takawira 1. So I went to Mapinduzi with Esau, with Otto. There were a few others. David Mumafongo, Dibugerudza. One of our trainers was Imaspara. There was Brown, who died under an anti-air. That's one guy I recall very well. Brown akafa chidza anti-air. So there it is. There was a same. I think VP was the camp commander.
Okay.
Mapinduzi, but Patakawira one. I don't recall very much. So we went through our training, basics. It was the spirit, it was the soul that took me through. Nothing to do with the physique. I went through. So we went through, and then on pass out, we were then taken into specializations. That's about June, about June. Yes, June. So we had to go a month of specialization. So we're broken into groups, Vamawiti anti-air, Vamawiti recoilless, Vamawiti motor 82, Vamawiti motor 60, Vamawiti LMG, Vamawiti HMG, I think. And so those groups were all selected. Takasara Tiripo, the ragtag, the riffraff, Watoto, the emaciated, and I was among those. So I'm going to engineering. And we were taken by this remarkable man called Jepe Chibende. Don't know if you have heard of that name. Yeah, you should have. If you have not, you want to chase that because he's deceased. You need to build his story because he rekindled the confidence in us. I don't want to claim as me, the individual.
Okay.
He renewed the energies of an emaciated, marginalized group of trainees who thought they were of no use to anybody. He was an engineer. He was an engineer, in military jargon. An engineer is the one who deals with demolition, explosives, etc., etc. Manje ndokumunda kweduka. So one of the key things about it, you want to understand, the composition of these explosives. What are they composed of? So he would sing, dynamite is TNT, is tetranitro-toluene. And then he would write it. He had this wonderful scroll about it, when he would do it. He had a chalkboard, And we were all given little books, A5.
A5.
Yeah. We had A5 notebooks and a pencil to write our notes. And you are doing that in O levels, O level, So I was one of the stars of that class.
Okay.
I would write notes. I would write notes copiously, and I would copy as they are. My diagrams, were based on what I was taught in physics by Derek Williams, teacher physics,
St. Augustine.
St. Augustine's. So I went through those things studiously, and it worked very well. And I enjoyed my lessons with the Deathbed, you know. And when I completed it, an instructor borrowed my book and said, "Can I have this book can I have a look at it?" I never saw it again. And anyway, I didn't need it. I didn't need it.
Yeah.
But, you know, imagine you are being asked to draw a circuit of how to lay a mine and detonate it remotely using electrical circuit. So how do you set the mine? How do you connect the electrical? So it was all about electricity and all that physics and all that kind of thing. It was important.
taigara mumakomo mumakomo panguva yehondo vakaimhanya takavatesa taigara mumakomo panguva yehondo vakaimhanya takavatesa vakomana vasikana magorira mumakomo vakaimhanya takavatesa
For these and more stories, tune in to Zim News Bit TV with Robert Tafumani.